Russia's Yuri Gagarin was the world's first cosmonaut. On April 12, 1961, he flew in the Soviet Union's Vostok spacecraft for 108 minutes, orbiting the Earth for a little more than one orbit. Gagarin became a cultural hero in the Soviet Union after the mission. Many famous astronauts came after him. We will get to know them, and we will mention the first astronaut who landed on the moon. The world's first astronaut, Yuri Gagarin. Gagarin's mission took place at a time when the United States and the Soviet Union were vying for technological supremacy in space. In October 1957, the Soviet Union launched its first satellite, Sputnik, into space. The Soviets conducted a test flight into orbit with a prototype of the Vostok spacecraft. Prior to Gagarin's flight, they launched a life-size doll named Ivan Ivanovich and a dog named Zvezdochka into orbit on this mission. After the test flight, the Soviets determined that the ship was capable of carrying a human into space. The story of the world's first astronaut. Yuri Alexeyevich Gagarin was born on March 9, 1934 in a rural town 100 miles outside Moscow, the third of four children. Gagarin saw a Russian Yak fighter plane and made an emergency landing near his home when he was a teenager. Years later, he enthusiastically accepted an invitation to join a flying club and traveled solo for the first time in 1955. He requested that his astronaut status be considered only a few years later. More than 200 fighter pilots of the Russian Air Force have been selected as cosmonaut candidates. These pilots were considered ideal because they had experience in high-pressure conditions and were exposed to the forces of acceleration and ejection. Gagarin, then a first lieutenant at the age of 27, was one of the pilots selected. The first spacecraft launched into space. The spacecraft Vostok 1 was launched from the Soviet launch pad on April 12, 1961, at 9:07 a.m. Moscow time. The spherical capsule has few controls on board because no one knows how the weightlessness will affect the pilot. The mission was performed either automatically or from the ground. Gagarin was to receive an override code that would allow him manual control in the event of an emergency, but Sergei Korolev, the chief designer of the Soviet space program, broke protocol and provided the code to the pilot before the flight. The flight of the world's first astronaut. Vostok 1 has traveled around the Earth once in 108 minutes, reaching a maximum altitude of 203 miles, 327 kilometers. The spacecraft included a 10-day supply in case the engines failed and Gagarin had to wait for the orbit to naturally decay. However, the supplies were unnecessary. Gagarin returned to Earth's atmosphere, maintaining consciousness despite being subjected to forces up to 8 times the force of gravity. There were no engines on Vostok 1 to slow its return, and there was no way to land it safely. Gagarin was ejected from a spaceship and parachuted to Earth from an altitude of about 4 miles, 7 kilometers. The Fédération Aéronautique Internationale (FAI), the regulator for aerospace records, has announced that the pilot must land the spacecraft for the mission to be considered an official space flight. In 1971, Gagarin set the record for being the world's first astronaut. His position in his community. Gagarin was an international hero when he came back to Earth. Hundreds of thousands of people cheered him as he entered Red Square, in Moscow's public square. Gagarin, a national treasure, traveled the world to commemorate the great achievement of the Soviet Union. Gagarin became a deputy of the Supreme Soviet of the USSR, the highest legislative body of the USSR, and leader of the cosmonaut detachment after returning home. The Soviets were reluctant to allow Gagarin back into space because they did not want to risk losing such an outstanding popular figure. Nevertheless, he continued to fly pilots for the Air Force. His death. Gagarin is still respected in Russian space museums more than 6 decades after his Historic voyage, with many artifacts, busts, and relics dedicated to him. His ashes are buried in the Moscow Kremlin, and a piece of his spacecraft is on display at the RKK Energia Museum. Gagarin, along with another pilot, was killed while testing a MiG-15 fighter jet on March 27, 1968. His wife and two daughters, Valentina Ivanovna and Goracheva, survived. Neil Armstrong, the first astronaut to land on the Moon. NASA astronaut and flight engineer Neil Armstrong on July 20, 1969, during Apollo 11. Went down in history as the first human to walk on the Moon. In 1966, Armstrong participated in NASA's Gemini 8 mission. He left NASA in 1971 and has remained involved in the space world, although he has mostly kept out of the spotlight. Armstrong passed away on August 25, 2012 at the age of 82. Armstrong was known for being humble when it came to his accomplishments, preferring to focus on the team that helped him get to the Moon rather than his initial steps. In an interview with Armstrong when asked how it felt to have his footprints on the Moon as a memory of him, according to The Independent, he replied, "I kind of hope someone gets up there one day and cleans them up." Life of Neil Armstrong. On August 5, 1930, Armstrong was born in Wapakoneta, Ohio, to Stephen Koenig Armstrong and Viola Louise Engel. Neil participated in the Korean War as a Navy pilot from 1949 to 1952. In 1955 he graduated from Purdue University with a BA in Aeronautical Engineering. He earned a master's degree in Aerospace Engineering from the University of Southern California in 1970, after several years of worldwide fame. Working for NASA, then known as NACA, or the National Advisory Committee on Aeronautics, as a test pilot, he flew the X-15, a rocket-shaped aircraft that explored the limits of high-altitude flight. Armstrong has flown more than 200 different planes during his long career as a pilot, ranging from jets to gliders to helicopters. Armstrong was selected as part of NASA's second group of astronauts in 1962. The tasks he did: he traveled on the two-seat Gemini missions to test space technology, as well as the three-seat Apollo missions, which eventually transported 12 people to the lunar surface. Armstrong's first flight occurred in March 1966 as the lead pilot for mission Gemini 8, which was the sixth manned mission in the series. Armstrong and pilot David Scott performed the first orbital dockings of two spacecraft, when their Gemini 8 spacecraft docked with an unmanned Agena target ship. However, the thruster on the Gemini 8 spacecraft became stuck, causing a major dilemma for the two-person crew. With the astronauts spinning faster than 1 revolution per second, Armstrong used re-entry system motors to regain control. The accident was the first major emergency in space, and while the mission was ultimately successful, the spacecraft had to collapse early due to the exhaustion of the re-entry system. In May 1968, while flying over the Moon Landing Research Vehicle, a strange instrument that could fly like a lunar lander and mimic a moon landing, Armstrong nearly got into a serious accident, this time inside Earth's atmosphere. NASA reports that Armstrong was forced to launch just seconds before the rocket crashed due to a lack of fuel for the spacecraft. Armstrong managed to pass unhurt. During the 2 hours and 36 minutes of walking on the lunar surface, Armstrong and Aldrin explored the surface together. They collected 48.5 pounds, 22 kilograms, of material from the surface, including 50 lunar rocks, as well as conducting experiments, planting an American flag, and speaking with Richard Nixon, the President of the United States at the time. On July 21, the Eagle crew blasted off safely from the Moon, docked with Columbia, and returned to Earth for a successful ocean landing on July 24. The astronauts went into quarantine to reduce the unlikely possibility of removing any potentially harmful debris from the Moon's soil. Then they went on a world tour to celebrate this trip. His death. Neil Armstrong passed away on August 25, 2012 at the age of 82, just weeks after undergoing heart surgery. Before his death he said his famous words, "This is one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind." The world's first American astronaut Alan Shepard. Navy Commander Alan Bartlett Shepard Jr. is the first American astronaut to travel into space when he was launched into space aboard the Freedom 7 space capsule on May 5, 1961. The 15-minute suborbital flight, which reached an altitude of 116 miles above Earth, was a landmark achievement for the administration National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA. NASA monitored the Soviets until the success of the Apollo lunar program in the late 1960s. Apollo 11, the three-stage spacecraft that brought American astronauts to the surface of the moon and brought them back to Earth, made a giant leap forward in July 1969. As part of the Apollo 14 mission to land on the moon, Alan Shepard, the first American astronaut, became the fifth astronaut. He walks on the moon on February 5, 1971. The first Syrian Arab astronaut, Mohammed Faris. He was a pilot with the rank of colonel in the Syrian Air Force, born in Aleppo, Syria. When he was selected to participate in the Intercosmos space program on September 30, 1985, he majored in navigation. In July 1987, he went to the Mir space station as a research astronaut for the Intercosmos program on the Soyuz TM-3 spacecraft, spending 7 days, 23 hours and 5 minutes in space. Aboard the Soyuz TM-2, he returned to Earth. He is credited with delivering the first piece of Earth and Earth to the Moon, a flask containing Damascus soil. On July 30, 1987, Knight was awarded the title Hero of the Soviet Union as well as the Order of Lenin. The first Arab Muslim astronaut, Sultan bin Salman bin Abdulaziz, was nominated by the Arab Satellite Communications Organization in 1985. AlSaud was born in Riyadh and holds a Bachelor of Arts in Mass Communication from the University of Denver, Colorado. He was originally a civilian pilot with a commercial pilot license. Prior to his trip, the House of Saud received extensive training, including how to launch the Arab satellite 320 kilometers above the Earth's surface and how to use a camera from the unit, Hamlide 500, to take pictures of geological features of the Arabian Peninsula. The world's first female cosmonaut, Valentina of Russia. Valentina Vladimirovna Tereshkova, born March 6, 1937, is a Russian engineer, former Russian cosmonaut and member of the Russian Federation. Made history as the first and youngest woman in space, she flew a solo mission aboard Vostok 6 on June 16, 1963. She orbited Earth 48 times and spent more than 3 days in space, making her the only woman to have traveled alone in space. The first Arab female astronaut. The first Arab astronaut in the United Arab Emirates in training to pursue a childhood dream, Noura al-Matroshi was one of 2 Emiratis chosen from thousands of applicants. At a time when the Gulf state looks to the stars. Later this year she will travel to the United States to train at NASA's Johnson Space Center.